The smell of sulfur and pulp soaked the air like a persistent fog, seeping into Harold Tanner's clothes, his skin, his lungs. After 27 years at Champion International Paper Company, he could identify the precise mixture of chemicals in the air by scent alone. Different batches of paper carried different smells. Newsprint had its own sharp tang, cardboard its earthy musk. This morning in June 1993, standing at his station overseeing the massive fourdrinier machine that transformed pulp slurry into smooth, even sheets, Harold caught the scent of something else beneath the familiar industrial bouquet. Something metallic and cold. Worry. He watched the enormous rollers spin, pressing water from the forming sheets with hypnotic precision. The machine hummed and vibrated beneath his hands, a living thing, reliable and constant. Everything else in Springfield might change, but the mill had always been there. It would always be there. "Hey, Harry," Mike Donahue shouted over the machine's roar, his voice barely audible above the industrial symphony. "Heard anything about the meeting?" Harold shook his head, focusing on the control panel. The pressure gauge was reading slightly high. He made a minor adjustment, felt the vibration change subtly beneath his fingertips. Perfect. He could tune this machine blindfolded, had spent more hours with it than with his own wife. "Management meeting all morning," Mike persisted, wiping sweat from his forehead with a rag that had once been white but was now stained with the colors of industrial work. Behind closed doors. So, Harold kept his eyes on the gauges. "They have meetings all the time. Foreman says they're suits from New York, corporate types." A thread of unease wound its way through Harold's chest, but he suppressed it with practiced ease. "Probably quarterly reviews or something. We hit our production targets last month." Mike gave him a look, the kind shared between men who have worked side by side long enough to communicate volumes with a glance. "Whatever you say, Harry." The whistle blew for lunch break. Harold wiped his hands on his coveralls and headed for his usual spot in the break room where his metal lunch pail waited in his locker. He'd packed the same lunch for nearly 3 decades. Ham sandwich on white bread, apple, thermos of coffee. Nancy had made his lunches for the first 20 years until arthritis made it too painful for her to do much in the kitchen. Now he made it himself each morning while she slept, her twisted fingers curled on the bedspread like delicate branches. The break room hummed with the low conversation of men who conserved words like resources, spending them only when necessary. But today there was an undercurrent, a tension that manifested in darting eyes and hushed voices. Closing the Fitchburg plant. Foreign competition. Cheaper to make it overseas. Harold unwrapped his sandwich and took a deliberate bite, chewing thoroughly. Rumors were always circulating. Back in '83, everyone had been convinced the mill was selling to Japanese investors. In '88, the talk was about computerized systems replacing half the workforce. None of it happened. The mill remained steady as the limestone bluffs that overlooked Buck Creek. "What do you think, Harry?" Dave Simmons asked from across the table. "About the suits?" Harold swallowed. "I think we've got the afternoon shift to worry about. Let management worry about management things." "My cousin works at the Mead plant in Chillicothe," Dave continued, ignoring Harold's dismissal. "Says they're cutting back shifts. Third-generation paper men getting pink slips." "Chillicothe isn't Springfield," Harold said firmly, "and Mead isn't Champion. Paper is paper, Harry, and American paper costs too much these days." Harold finished his sandwich in silence, refusing to engage. When the whistle blew again, he returned to his station with relief. The machines didn't gossip or worry. They simply performed their function hour after hour, day after day, with a dependability that human beings could never match. There was honesty in mechanical systems, certainty. The afternoon shift passed without incident. Harold made his rounds, checking gauges, inspecting the massive rolls of finished paper, recording production numbers in the logbook with his neat, precise handwriting. His father had taught him penmanship. A man's writing tells others what kind of man he is, along with everything else about being a man. How to shake hands firmly, how to look another person in the eye, how to put in an honest day's work. His father had worked at the Springfield mill for 41 years, starting after returning from the Pacific in 1945. He'd been there when the original International Paper Mill was purchased by Champion in 1967, had survived 3 ownership changes and 2 major renovations. When Harold turned 18 in 1966, there had been no question where he would work. The mill provided the best jobs in town, union wages, benefits, security. The mill made this town, his father used to say. Remember that, Harold? Paper built Springfield. At the end of his shift, Harold cleaned his station, changed out of his work clothes in the locker room, and headed for the parking lot. The June evening was warm, the air heavy with humidity from the river. In the distance, the mill's stacks continued to release plumes of steam and smoke into the darkening sky. The sight reassured him. As long as the stacks were smoking, there was work to be done. His 1986 Chevy pickup started on the second try. Harold let it idle a moment, listening to the engine with a mechanic's ear. There was a slight rattle that hadn't been there last week. He made a mental note to check it on Saturday. The radio played low, a Springsteen song about factories closing down in New Jersey. Harold switched stations. The drive home took 12 minutes exactly. Harold had timed it years ago and prided himself on maintaining the same schedule each day. His neighborhood on Springfield's west side had once been solidly middle class, filled with factory workers from the paper mills, the International Harvester plant, and Crowell Collier Publishing. Now it showed signs of decline, peeling paint, untrimmed hedges, a boarded-up house at the end of the block where the Matthews family had lived until Bill Matthews lost his job at Harvester and they moved to Columbus. Harold pulled into the driveway of the ranch-style home he and Nancy had purchased in 1975. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, attached garage. The American dream, financed by Champion International Paper Company. "Nan," he called, entering through the side door into the kitchen. "I'm home." Nancy Tanner sat at the kitchen table, her fingers working slowly at a piece of embroidery. At 62, her face showed every hour of worry she'd experienced in her life, etched into fine lines around her eyes and mouth. But her eyes still held the warmth that had first attracted Harold at a high school dance in 1963. "How was work?" she asked, setting aside her needlework. "Fine, same as usual." He bent to kiss her cheek, smelling the lavender lotion she used for her hands. "What's for dinner?" "Meatloaf, it's in the oven." "Should be ready in 15 minutes. She looked up at him, studying his face. "You look tired, Harry." Long day. He didn't mention the rumors, the corporate meeting, the suits from New York. No sense worrying her. "How are your hands today?" "Better, the new pills help. I finished the pillowcase for Heather." She gestured toward the embroidery hoop, "for the baby's room." Their daughter Heather lived in Cincinnati with her husband, an accountant for Procter & Gamble. She was due to deliver their first grandchild in August. Harold felt a surge of pride thinking about it, followed by a pang of something else. Heather had left Springfield right after college, one of many young people who fled the declining industrial town for brighter prospects elsewhere. "It's beautiful," he said, examining the delicate flowers Nancy had stitched despite the pain in her joints. "She'll love it." They ate dinner in front of the television, watching the local news. The lead story was about a new shopping center being built near the interstate, promising retail jobs. Harold snorted. "Retail jobs? What's a retail job pay? Minimum wage, no benefits. How's a man supposed to support a family on that?" Nancy didn't answer, used to his occasional outbursts about the changing economy. She'd heard it all before. After dinner, Harold retreated to his workshop in the garage while Nancy watched her evening shows. The workshop was his sanctuary, a place where he could shape wood with the same precision he monitored paper production. Currently, he was building a cradle for the coming grandchild, oak with maple inlays. Working with his hands quieted the unease that had followed him home from the mill. The phone rang at 9:17 p.m. Harold heard Nancy answer it, then call his name with an edge to her voice that made him put down his tools immediately. "Harry, it's Mike Donahue." Mike never called in the evening. Harold wiped his hands on a rag and took the cordless phone Nancy held out. "Mike, what's going on?" "Harry, you hear the news." "It's all over town." Mike's voice held an unfamiliar tremor. "Figured you'd want to know right away." "What news?" "Champion's selling the mill, Harry, to some foreign outfit. They announced it after our shift. Probably why all those suits were there today." Harold's grip tightened on the phone. "What are you talking about? Who told you this?" "It's official, just came over the radio. They're selling to International Paper Company." The suits are saying they'll evaluate operations after the sale, but everyone knows what that means. That doesn't mean anything, Harold said firmly. Companies buy other companies all the time. Doesn't mean they'll close the mill. Wake up, Harry, they're not buying it to keep it running. They've got newer facilities elsewhere. They're buying it to shut it down. You don't know that, Harold's voice was tight, controlled. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. My brother-in-law works in HR, says they were printing separation packages this afternoon. After hanging up, Harold stood in the workshop, surrounded by the tools and projects that defined his off-hours existence. The cradle sat half-finished on his workbench. The smell of sawdust filled his nostrils, so different from the chemical scents of the mill, yet equally comforting in its familiarity. Nancy appeared in the doorway, her silhouette tense with concern. Harry, what is it? Nothing, he said automatically. Just rumors, you know how people talk. But later that night, lying awake beside Nancy's sleeping form, Harold couldn't dismiss the cold weight in his stomach. The mill had always been there. He had counted on its permanence, had built his entire life around the certainty of its smokestacks against the Springfield sky. What if this time the rumors were true? The official announcement came 3 days later. Champion International was indeed selling its Springfield operations to International Paper Company, its longtime competitor. The sale included not just the main mill where Harold worked, but also the adjacent converting facility and the pulp preparation plant, 3,000 jobs in total. The company representatives used phrases like strategic realignment and operational synergies. They spoke of market realities and global competition. They did not use the word closing, not yet. But the writing was on the wall for anyone willing to read it. International Paper already had newer, more efficient mills in the South, where non-union labor and pine forests made production cheaper. They didn't need Springfield's aging facility with its higher costs and older technology. Harold listened to the announcement over the mill's PA system, standing beside his beloved Fordrinier machine. His face remained impassive, betraying nothing of the earthquake happening beneath his feet. Around him, younger workers cursed or muttered in shock. The older ones, like Harold, simply absorbed the news in silence, as they had absorbed every other hardship in their lives. "What do you think will happen, Harry?" asked Trevor Jenkins, a 26-year-old who'd started at the mill right out of high school. "We keep working," Harold said firmly. "Nothing's changed yet." But everything had changed. Harold could feel it in the altered rhythm of the mill, in the distracted movements of his coworkers, in the new edge of desperation in casual conversations. And he could see it in management's sudden distance, the way supervisors avoided eye contact, the way meetings were canceled, the way maintenance requests were delayed. At home, Harold maintained a stoic optimism that felt increasingly hollow, even to himself. "They won't close it," he told Nancy over dinner. "It's a profitable operation. Has been for decades." Nancy watched him with eyes that had seen too much of life to be easily deceived. "What does Mike say?" "Mike worries too much." Harold cut his pork chop with precise movements. "Always has." "Heather called today. She saw the news online." Harold's knife paused momentarily. "What did you tell her?" "The truth, that we don't know anything yet." "Good," he resumed eating, "because we don't." That night Harold dreamed of his father. They were walking through the mill together, but the machines were silent, covered in dust. His father kept pointing at gauges, expecting Harold to read them, but all the needles were frozen at 0. "You have to keep them running," his father said, his voice echoing. "You have to keep them running or everything stops." Harold woke at 3:17 a.m., sweat-soaked and disoriented. Beside him, Nancy breathed evenly, untroubled by whatever ghosts were visiting her sleep. He slipped out of bed and went to the kitchen, where he sat in the dark, listening to the refrigerator hum and the occasional car passing on the street outside. For the first time in his adult life, Harold Tanner allowed himself to imagine a future without the mill. The thought made his chest constrict, as if the air in the room had suddenly thinned. Who was he if not a papermaker? What defined a man if not his work? His father's voice echoed in his memory. "A man provides. That's what men do." Harold had built his entire identity around that simple principle. He provided. He was reliable, steady, constant, like the machines he tended. The mill had given him the means to buy this house, to put food on the table, to send Heather to college, to pay for Nancy's medications. Without the mill, what would he provide? Who would he be? At 4:30 a.m., Harold made coffee and prepared his lunch just as he did every workday. Ham sandwich on white bread, apple, thermos of coffee. The ritual calmed him, returned him to the certainty of routine. By the time he backed the Chevy out of the driveway at 5:15, his moment of middle-of-the-night panic seemed distant and foolish. The mill would survive, it had to. July brought hotter temperatures and a thickening atmosphere of uncertainty at the mill. International paper executives visited, touring the facility with clipboards and serious expressions. They asked questions about production rates, energy consumption, maintenance schedules. They never spoke directly to the line workers, only to supervisors and managers. Harold watched them from his station, noting their clean hands and pressed shirts. They looked at the machines, not the men who operated them. Rumors proliferated like bacteria in a petri dish. One day, word spread that the mill would be modernized with a $50 million investment. The next, everyone knew that closure was imminent. Harold ignored it all, focusing on his gauges, his logs, his maintenance checks. The work was the only truth he could rely on, but even Harold couldn't ignore the memo that appeared on the bulletin board in mid-July. Notice, effective immediately, all overtime is suspended until further notice. Capital improvements are postponed pending operational review. Please direct all questions to your supervisor. What did I tell you? Mike said, reading the notice over Harold's shoulder. They're cutting costs before they cut us loose. It's standard during a transition, Harold responded, though he had no idea if that was true. Doesn't mean anything. My cousin says they did the same thing in Chillicothe before the layoffs started. Mike's face was haggard, the lines around his mouth deeper than they'd been a month ago. I've got 20 years in, Harry. What am I supposed to do now? I'm 53 years old. Who's going to hire me? Harold had no answer. He had 37 years in, 4 more to his full pension, if the mill closed now. He refused to complete the thought. That evening, Harold stopped at Schuler's Hardware on his way home. He needed router bits for the Cradle project. The store had been on the same corner of Main Street since 1947, owned by the same family. Harold had been buying tools there since he was a teenager. Old man Schuler himself was behind the counter, stooped now with age but still sharp-eyed and knowledgeable. He greeted Harold with a nod. How are things at the mill, Harry? Fine, Harold said automatically, then reconsidered. Well, uncertain, I guess, with the sale. Schuler nodded gravely. Heard about that? Shame what's happening to manufacturing in this country. First International Harvester pulls out, then Crowell Collier shuts down the printing plant, now the paper mills. He shook his head. This used to be a good town for working people. Still is, Harold said, more sharply than he intended. Sure, Schuler handed him the router bits. It's just changing, that's all. Everything changes. Some things shouldn't. Schuler regarded him with the patient gaze of a man who had seen 8 decades of life. Maybe so, but they do anyway. On the drive home, Harold took a detour through downtown Springfield. The city had been built on manufacturing, paper mills, farm equipment, publishing. For generations, these industries had provided stable, well-paying jobs that allowed workers to buy homes, raise families, build futures. The evidence of that prosperity was still visible in the solid brick buildings and wide streets, the parks and schools that tax dollars had built. But now Harold saw the empty storefronts, the for-lease signs, the discount stores that had replaced local businesses. The once bustling shopping district was eerily quiet at 6 p.m. on a weekday. He passed the old International Harvester plant, closed since 1980, its windows broken, its vast parking lot cracked and weed-infested. Is this what would happen to the Champion mill, to his mill? For the first time, Harold allowed himself to truly see the decline that had been happening around him for years. Springfield's population had peaked in 1970 at 82,000. Now it was below 70,000 and still falling as young people left for Columbus, Cincinnati, anywhere with growing industries and opportunities. Harold had always believed that if you worked hard and remained loyal, you would be rewarded. That was the contract: give your best years to a company and that company would take care of you. His father had lived by that creed, and Harold had followed his example without question. But what if the contract no longer applied? What if loyalty meant nothing in this new economy that valued only efficiency and profit margins? These thoughts followed Harold home like unwelcome shadows. Nancy could see something was wrong the moment he walked through the door, but she didn't press him. After 37 years of marriage, she knew when to let him process things in his own time. That night, they watched the national news together. The lead story was about a factory in Michigan closing, moving operations to Mexico. The camera panned across workers clearing out their lockers, some crying, others angry. One man, about Harold's age, stared directly into the camera with empty eyes. "I gave them 30 years, the man said, his voice flat. "Now they say I cost too much. That's what a man is worth these days." Too much. Harold changed the channel. August arrived with suffocating humidity and the first concrete signs of what was coming. International Paper announced a strategic reorganization that would optimize operations across recently acquired facilities. The corporate speak couldn't disguise the reality. The Springfield mill would be phased out over the next 6 months, with operations consolidated at newer facilities in the South. 3,000 jobs would be eliminated. There would be separation packages based on years of service. There would be job placement assistance. There would be retraining opportunities. There would not be a future for papermaking in Springfield, Ohio. Harold received the news standing in the same spot where he had spent the past 27 years, next to the Fourdrinier machine that had been as familiar to him as his own heartbeat. The foreman delivered the announcement with downcast eyes, unable to look directly at the men whose livelihoods were evaporating. The mill fell silent in a way Harold had never experienced before. Even during maintenance shutdowns there was noise, the clang of tools, the shouts of workers, the hiss of steam being vented. But now there was only the sound of breathing, of men standing shoulder to shoulder, absorbing a blow none had fully believed would come despite all the warning signs. When, someone finally asked, department by department, some immediately, others over the next 6 months as orders are filled or transferred, HR will meet with everyone individually to discuss timelines and separation packages. And then what? The question came from Trevor Jenkins, the young worker who had looked up to Harold. What are we supposed to do then? The foreman had no answer. Harold worked through his shift in a fog. His hands performed their familiar tasks while his mind tried to grasp what was happening. After 27 years at Champion, after watching his father put in 41 years before that, it seemed impossible that it could end like this. A corporate announcement, a timetable for closure, and then nothing. The machines would stop. The smokestacks would go cold. The constant industrial heartbeat that had pulsed through Springfield for over a century would flatline. What would be left of the city? What would be left of him? Harold had his meeting with HR the following day. A young woman with a sympathetic smile explained his options. Because of his seniority, he would receive 26 weeks of severance pay, extended health benefits, and outplacement services. He could begin drawing his pension early, though at a reduced rate. "You're actually one of the lucky ones, Mr. Tanner," she said, sliding papers across the desk for his signature. "With your years of service, your package is quite generous." Lucky. Harold signed where indicated, his signature as precise as ever despite the tremor he felt inside. "There's also a retraining allowance," she continued. "The company will pay for courses at the community college. Many employees find new careers this way." "I'm 60 years old," Harold said, the first words he'd spoken during the meeting. Her smile faltered slightly. "Well, there are still options. The job placement service has connections with employers throughout the region." Harold nodded, taking the packet of information she offered. "Is that all?" "Unless you have questions." He had 1,000 questions, but none she could answer. How do you start over at 60? How do you remake yourself when everything you knew is gone? What happens to a city when its economic heart is cut out? "No questions," he said, rising from his chair. She extended her hand. "Thank you for your service to the company, Mr. Tanner. 37 years is remarkable." He shook her hand automatically, the gesture as empty as her words. 37 years reduced to a packet of papers and a corporate platitude. Outside the HR office, Harold found Mike waiting his turn along with a dozen other workers. Mike's face was gray with strain. "How bad is it?" he asked. "About what we expected," Harold replied, not wanting to share the details of his package in front of the others. Some would receive far less based on their shorter service. "This is bullshit," said a younger worker, Damon Kelly, who had maybe 5 years at the mill. "They can't just throw us away like this." "They can do whatever they want," said another man. "We're just numbers on a spreadsheet to them." Harold left without joining the angry conversation that followed. He wasn't ready to give voice to what he was feeling, a complex mixture of betrayal, fear, and something deeper that he couldn't yet name. He drove home in silence, the radio off, the windows up despite the heat. Nancy was waiting on the front porch, alerted by a neighbor whose husband had already received his notice. Her face showed the concern she couldn't hide, but she asked no questions as he approached. Instead, she simply held out her arms. Harold embraced her, feeling the fragility of her frame against his chest. For a moment, he allowed himself to lean into her strength, to draw from the well of resilience she had always possessed. Then he straightened, squared his shoulders, and led her inside. "I've got 26 weeks of severance," he said, laying out the facts as if reporting on someone else's situation. "Health insurance for a year. Pension starts immediately if I want, but at a reduced rate." Nancy nodded, absorbing the information. "When is your last day?" "October 15th. They're keeping some of us on to finish current orders and train the workers at the South Carolina plant who will be taking over production." The irony wasn't lost on Harold. His final assignment would be to make himself obsolete. "That's good," Nancy said cautiously. "Gives us time to figure things out." Harold nodded, though he had no idea what figuring things out might entail. His entire adult life had been structured around the mill, its shifts, its demands, its rhythms. Without that framework, he was adrift. "I'm going to work on the cradle," he said, needing the comfort of wood and tools, of creating something tangible when everything else seemed to be dissolving around him. In the workshop, Harold lost himself in the precise measurements and careful cuts that would form the cradle for his grandchild. The work demanded focus, leaving no room for the anxiety that had been building since the announcement. His hands, strong and capable from decades of physical labor, shaped the wood with an artisan's touch. The phone rang at 7:30 p.m. Nancy answered, then called out to him, "It's Heather." Harold set down his tools and took the phone. "Hello, sweetheart." "Dad," Heather's voice was concerned, direct. She had always been forthright, even as a child. "Mom told me about the mill. I'm so sorry." "It's all right," he said automatically. "These things happen." "No, Dad, it's not all right, it's terrible. After all the years you've given them." "It's business," he interrupted, not wanting to hear his own bitter thoughts echoed back to him. "The world changes." "What are you going to do?" It was the question he'd been avoiding since the announcement. What was he going to do? What could a 60-year-old papermaker do in a world that no longer valued paper or the men who made it? "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I've got time to figure it out." "You could move to Cincinnati," Heather suggested. "Be closer to us and the baby. Housing is affordable in some of the suburbs, and there might be jobs." "I'm not leaving Springfield," Harold said firmly. The idea of abandoning the city where he'd spent his entire life, where his parents were buried, where every street held memories, was unthinkable. "This is home." The conversation continued, with Heather making suggestions and Harold deflecting them. He knew she meant well, but he couldn't bear to think that far ahead. Not yet. After hanging up, Harold returned to his workshop, but the peace he'd found in woodworking earlier had evaporated. Heather's question echoed in his mind. "What are you going to do?" For the first time in his life, Harold Tanner had no answer. The next morning, Harold went to work as usual. He packed his lunch, ham sandwich on white bread, apple, thermos of coffee, and kissed Nancy goodbye. He drove the familiar route to the mill, parked in his usual spot, and walked through the gates that had framed his working life. But everything felt different. The mill itself seemed to be mourning, its noises more subdued, its energy diminished. Workers moved through their tasks mechanically, conversations were muted, laughter non-existent. At his station, Harold found a manila envelope with his name on it. Inside was a detailed timeline for the machine's decommissioning, along with instructions for documenting operational procedures for the South Carolina team. Harold was to serve as the primary contact for transferring knowledge about the Fordrinier machine's particular quirks and maintenance needs. He was being asked to assist in dismantling his own livelihood. For a brief, rebellious moment, Harold considered refusing. He could throw the envelope in the trash, walk out, leave them to figure it out themselves. But the thought was fleeting. He had never shirked responsibility in his life, and he wouldn't start now, regardless of the circumstances. So he began the process of documenting 3 decades of accumulated knowledge, the subtle vibration that indicated a roller needed adjustment, the specific sound of pulp flowing correctly, the exact pressure needed for different paper weights. It was knowledge that lived in his hands, his ears, his very bones, not easily transferred to checklists and manuals. During lunch break, the mood in the break room was dark. Men who normally ate in comfortable silence now voiced their anger, their fear, their confusion. "My mortgage has 15 years left," said Dave Simmons. "Who's going to hire me at 55? McDonald's. I've got 2 kids in high school," added another worker. "Was saving for their college, now I'll be lucky to keep the lights on." "It's all going overseas," said a third. "Everything we make they can make cheaper somewhere else. America doesn't make anything anymore." Harold ate his sandwich in silence, listening. The conversations swirled with recriminations against management, against foreign competition, against politicians who had failed to protect American manufacturing. The anger was raw, unfiltered, desperate. "What about you, Harry?" Dave asked suddenly. "You've been here longer than most. What are you going to do?" All eyes turned to Harold. They were looking to him, he realized, as one of the senior men for some wisdom or insight, but he had none to offer. "Take it one day at a time," he said finally. "That's all any of us can do." It wasn't the answer they wanted, but it was the only one he had. After work, Harold didn't drive directly home. Instead, he found himself pulling into the parking lot of O'Reilly's, a bar frequented by mill workers. He rarely drank, a beer on weekends while watching baseball, occasionally a second if the Reds were winning. But today he felt drawn to the dark, wood-paneled interior where men like himself gathered. The bar was already crowded, though it was barely 4 p.m. Harold recognized faces from various departments at the mill, all drawn to this familiar refuge. He nodded to acquaintances as he made his way to the bar and ordered a draft beer. "On the house, Harry," said the bartender, Sean O'Reilly, son of the original owner. "Heard about the mill, damn shame." Harold tried to pay anyway, but Sean waved him off. "First one's on me for all you mill guys today. God knows you've kept this place in business long enough." Harold took his beer to a corner table where he could observe without being drawn into conversation. The bar hummed with the voices of men trying to make sense of what had happened, their anger fueled by alcohol and shared grievance. 30 years I gave them," one man said, his voice carrying across the room. "Missed my kids' baseball games, worked doubles, came in on weekends, and this is how they thank me." "It's the damn Japanese," said another. "Flooding the market with cheap paper, government should put tariffs on that stuff." "It's not the Japanese," argued a third. "It's the corporations, they don't care about American workers. All they see is the bottom line." Harold sipped his beer slowly, watching these men, his coworkers, his friends, struggle with the same questions that plagued him. What had happened to the promise of American manufacturing? To the social contract between workers and companies, to the future they had all counted on? A younger man, maybe 30, grew increasingly loud as he drank. "We should do something. Protest, strike something, they can't just throw us away." "Strike against what?" someone responded. "The mill's closing either way." "Then we make them pay attention, make the news. Show the world what's happening to places like Springfield." Harold finished his beer and left without engaging. The anger in O'Reilly's was palpable, but it offered no solutions, no path forward. Just the temporary comfort of shared grievance. Driving home through Springfield streets, Harold saw the city with new eyes, the boarded-up storefronts on Main Street, the weed-choked lot where a manufacturing facility had once stood. The for sale signs on houses throughout once stable neighborhoods. Springfield had been dying by inches for years, and he had refused to see it, focused instead on the steady rhythm of his own work at the mill. Now, with the mill's closure, Springfield would face another body blow: more unemployment, more families leaving, more empty buildings and diminished tax revenues. The spiral would accelerate. At home, Harold found Nancy on the phone with her sister in Toledo. He heard fragments of their conversation as he hung his keys on the hook by the door. "Don't know yet," still in shock, really. "Too early to make decisions." He went straight to the workshop without interrupting. The cradle was nearly finished, needing only final sanding and a coat of varnish. Harold ran his hand over the smooth oak surface, feeling the grain beneath his fingertips. There was satisfaction in creating something tangible, something that would outlast him. That's what work at the mill had meant too, creating something real, something necessary: paper for books, for packaging, for communication. Not abstract financial instruments or digital services that existed only as electrons, but actual products that people used every day. Who would he be without that purpose? Nancy found him there an hour later, still sanding the cradle with meticulous attention. "It's beautiful, Harry," she said, resting a hand on his shoulder. "Heather will love it." Harold nodded, focusing on a spot where the wood needed further smoothing. "I'll finish it this weekend. Want to get it shipped before the baby arrives." Nancy watched him work for a moment longer. "I made pot roast for dinner, your favorite." It was a peace offering, an attempt at normalcy. Harold accepted it with gratitude. "I'll clean up and be right in." Over dinner, they maintained the appearance of routine. Nancy mentioned neighborhood news. Harold commented on the Reds' latest losing streak. Neither discussed the mill directly, though its shadow loomed over every word. Finally, as Nancy served apple pie for dessert, she broached the subject. "I called the bank today, talked to Mr. Whitman about the mortgage." Harold looked up sharply. "Why would you do that?" "Because we need to know where we stand, Harry, if we need to make adjustments." "We're fine," he said firmly. "I've got severance, we've got savings." "I know. But I wanted to understand our options. Mr. Whitman was very helpful, said we could refinance if necessary, maybe lower the payments." Harold felt a flash of irritation. "We're not charity cases, Nan. We don't need special treatment." "It's not charity to plan ahead," she said gently. "It's just being sensible." He knew she was right, but the idea of renegotiating terms, of admitting financial vulnerability, struck at the core of his identity as provider and head of household. It was one thing to face the loss of his job, it was another to acknowledge its ripple effects on every aspect of their lives. "Let's just take it one day at a time," he said, echoing what he'd told the men at the mill. "No need to make drastic changes yet." Nancy nodded, though her eyes told him she wasn't entirely convinced. "One day at a time," she agreed, "but we should at least talk about the possibilities." "Such as," he braced himself. "Such as whether it makes sense to keep this big house with just the two of us, or whether we should consider other options for the future." "This is our home," Harold said, an edge entering his voice. "We raised Heather here. All our memories are here." "I know, Harry, I love this house too. I'm just saying we should be open to all possibilities." Harold didn't respond, focusing instead on his pie. The thought of selling their home, the physical manifestation of everything he'd worked for, was too painful to contemplate. It represented stability, achievement, the fulfillment of the American dream that had been promised to men like him who worked hard and played by the rules. If he lost that too, what would remain? September brought no relief from the crushing heat or the grinding anxiety that had settled over the mill. Production schedules were being wound down, machines shut off one by one as orders were completed. Each day, more workers received their final paychecks and left for the last time, carrying boxes of personal items and decades of memories. Harold continued documenting the Fourdrinier machine's operations, working alongside engineers from the South Carolina plant who would oversee its dismantling and potential relocation. They were polite enough, these younger men with their clipboards and digital cameras, but they looked at the machine with different eyes, seeing components and specifications, not the living heart of a community. "This is an older model," one engineer commented, making notes. "Probably more efficient to scrap it and install new equipment." Harold felt the comment like a physical blow. Scrap it. As if the machine that had provided livelihoods for hundreds of families over decades was just outdated metal without value or meaning. It's produced more tonnage than any other machine in the fleet, Harold said, unable to keep the defensiveness from his voice. Still runs at 98% efficiency when properly maintained. The engineer glanced up, perhaps hearing the emotion behind the factual statement. I'm sure it's been a good machine, Mr. Tanner, but technology moves on, you know. Technology moves on, people move on. Cities move on or they don't, and they die. That evening, Harold attended a community meeting at Springfield High School. The gym was packed with mill workers and their families, local business owners, city officials, all trying to understand what the closure would mean for Springfield and what, if anything, could be done to mitigate its impact. The mayor spoke first, a heavy-set man with thinning hair who had once worked at Crowell Collier before it closed in the 1980s. This is a difficult time for our city, he began, his voice echoing in the cavernous gym. The loss of these jobs will affect all of us, directly or indirectly. But Springfield has faced challenges before, and we will face this one together. He outlined efforts to attract new businesses, to provide retraining for displaced workers, to secure federal and state assistance. The words sounded hollow to Harold, who had heard similar promises when International Harvester closed, when Crowell Collier shut down, when other manufacturers left one by one. A representative from the State Employment Office spoke about job placement services. An official from the community college discussed retraining programs. A social worker explained how to apply for various forms of assistance. Then the floor was opened for questions and comments. The line at the microphone grew quickly. What kind of jobs are we talking about replacing these with? Asked a mill worker in his 50s. Minimum wage retail work. Because that won't pay my mortgage. My family has worked at the mill for 3 generations, said another man. What am I supposed to tell my kids about their future in Springfield? Why isn't anyone fighting this? Demanded a woman, her voice shaking with emotion. Why are we just accepting that they can come in, buy our mill, and shut it down? Where are our political leaders? Where are our unions? The questions grew more pointed, the anger more evident. Harold sat quietly, watching the community's pain and fear manifest in public for the first time. These were proud people, self-sufficient, hardworking, not accustomed to asking for help or expressing vulnerability. Their anger masked deeper emotions, grief for what was being lost, fear for what would come next. A young woman approached the microphone. Harold recognized her as Jennifer Wilson, who taught English at the high school. Heather had been in her class years ago. I know everyone is focused on the immediate impact of the closure, she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. But I'd like us to think bigger for a moment. What kind of city do we want Springfield to be in 10 years? In 20? Do we want to keep chasing manufacturing jobs that might leave again, or do we want to reimagine what this city could become? Her question hung in the air. Harold found himself leaning forward, waiting for an answer that didn't come. I don't have solutions, Jennifer continued after a moment, but I know that clinging to the past won't build our future. We need new ideas, new visions for what Springfield can be. Some in the audience murmured agreement, others shook their heads dismissively. Harold wasn't sure how he felt. The notion of reimagining Springfield seemed abstract, disconnected from the concrete reality of 3,000 lost jobs and the ripple effects that would follow. Yet as the meeting continued, Harold found himself returning to Jennifer's question. What did he want for Springfield's future? For his own future, he had never considered these questions before. The path had always seemed clear: work at the mill, provide for his family, retire with a pension. The American dream, simple and attainable. Now that path had disappeared, and he stood at a crossroads with no map. After the meeting, Harold lingered in the parking lot, watching families disperse into the warm September evening. The conversations around him were subdued, weighted with the enormity of what was happening. No one had answers, only questions and fears. He noticed Mike Donahue standing alone by his truck, smoking a cigarette with jerky, nervous movements. Harold approached, concerned by his friend's haggard appearance. You all right, Mike? Mike exhaled a plume of smoke. Sure, just watching 30 years of my life go up in smoke like this cigarette, he laughed without humor. You Taking it day by day, Harold said, the phrase becoming a mantra he no longer quite believed. I applied at the Honda plant in Marysville, Mike said after a moment. They're not hiring production workers my age, of course. But they had an opening for a janitor, Harry, after 30 years as a skilled worker. Harold didn't know what to say, the indignity of it was palpable. Did you apply? He asked finally. Yeah. Didn't get it. Mike dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. Too many applicants, too many desperate middle-aged men willing to clean toilets to keep a roof over their heads. The defeat in Mike's voice cut through Harold's protective shell of stoicism. This was happening not just to him but to all of them, men who had believed in the promise that hard work would be rewarded, that loyalty mattered, that there was dignity in making things with your hands. We'll figure something out, Harold said, the words sounding empty even to himself. Sure we will. Mike opened his truck door. See you tomorrow, Harry, another day closer to the end. As Harold drove home, he took a detour past the mill. The facility sprawled across dozens of acres, its buildings massive against the darkening sky. Smoke still rose from some stacks, but others were already cold and silent. The parking lot, once full at all hours as 3 shifts kept the mill running continuously, was now half empty. For generations, the paper mills had defined Springfield. They had provided not just jobs but identity, community, purpose. What would replace them? Could anything? Harold remembered his father bringing him to the mill as a boy, pointing out the giant machines with pride. This is where real work happens, Harold, men making things that matter. The lesson had stuck. Harold had never questioned that making paper, tangible, useful paper, was work that mattered, but what if it didn't matter anymore? At least not enough to keep the mills running in Springfield, Ohio. The question haunted him all the way home. October arrived with a chill in the air and an accelerating sense of finality at the mill. Machines were being shut down permanently now, their components cataloged for potential reuse or sale. Sections of the facility stood dark and silent, accumulating dust where once activity had been constant. Harold's last day was set for October 15th, just 2 weeks away. The Fourdrinier machine he had tended for nearly 3 decades was scheduled for decommissioning on October 12th. 3 days before his own termination, he would watch the heart of his working life go still. The thought was almost unbearable. At home, tension simmered beneath the surface of daily routines. Nancy had begun sorting through closets and storage spaces, disposing of accumulated possessions to simplify, she said. Harold recognized it as preparation for potential downsizing, though neither of them acknowledged this directly. Heather called more frequently now, her concern evident despite her attempts at normal conversation. She was due to deliver their grandchild any day, but had postponed her parents' planned visit due to complications that required bed rest. The doctor says everything's fine, she assured them, just being cautious. You can come after the baby's born and things settle down. Harold sensed she was trying to shield them from the expense of travel, from the stress of being away from home during this uncertain time. It added another layer of frustration to his situation. He couldn't even properly support his daughter through her first pregnancy. On October 10th, with just 5 days remaining in his employment, Harold received a phone call at work. Such calls were rare and usually meant emergency. His heart raced as he answered. Harry, it was Heather, her voice tight with a combination of pain and excitement. It's happening, the baby's coming early. Are you all right? Is everything okay? Harold gripped the phone. Yes, everything's fine, just earlier than expected. I'm at the hospital now, they say it could be a few hours still. We'll come, Harold said immediately. We'll leave right away. Dad, you don't have to. We're coming, he repeated firmly. You're not going through this without your mother there. After hanging up, Harold informed his supervisor of the situation. Given the circumstances, both the impending birth and Harold's imminent termination, permission to leave was granted without hesitation. Congratulations, Harry, the supervisor said, awkwardly extending his hand. At least there's some good news, huh? Harold nodded, shook the offered hand, and went to gather his personal items. As he prepared to leave the mill, possibly for the last time if his final days were covered by his remaining personal time, he paused at the Fourdrinier machine. Its rhythmic hum had been the soundtrack of his working life. He placed a hand on its warm metal surface, feeling the vibrations that had become so familiar he could diagnose problems by touch alone. "Goodbye, old girl," he murmured, feeling foolish for addressing a machine this way, yet unable to depart without some acknowledgement of what it had meant to him. The drive home took exactly 12 minutes, as always. Nancy was already packing when he arrived, her movements quick and purposeful despite her arthritic hands. "I called Jean across the street," she said without preamble. "She'll water the plants and collect the mail, and I called your sister to let her know we'll be gone for a few days." Harold nodded, grateful for his wife's efficiency. "I'll get the suitcases from the attic." "Already did." "They're in the bedroom." Nancy paused, studying his face. "Are you all right, Harry, coming back from the mill?" "I'm fine," he said automatically. "Just want to get on the road. It's a 2-hour drive to Cincinnati." Nancy touched his arm, her fingers gentle against his sleeve. "It's okay to feel everything you're feeling, you know, about the mill, about becoming a grandfather, about all of it." Harold swallowed hard against the sudden tightness in his throat. "Let's just focus on Heather and the baby right now." Nancy nodded, understanding as always. "I'll finish packing, you load the car." The cradle, in the rush of preparation, Harold almost forgot. He went to the workshop and carefully wrapped the completed cradle in moving blankets, securing it with twine. The piece represented hours of labor, each joint and surface finished to perfection. If his work at the mill was ending, at least this creation, this gift for his grandchild, would endure. They left Springfield as the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the streets. Harold drove in silence, his mind oscillating between concern for Heather and the knowledge that when he returned, his life would be irrevocably changed. The mill would be close to him. For the first time since he was 18 years old, he would wake without purpose, without a place to go, without work that defined him. Nancy seemed to sense his thoughts. "It will be a new chapter, Harry, for both of us." He glanced at her, this woman who had stood beside him through every challenge of their adult lives. "I'm not sure I know how to start a new chapter at 60. "None of us knows until we do it," she said simply, "but we will. Together." The Cincinnati skyline appeared as dusk fell, its buildings illuminated against the darkening sky. Harold navigated unfamiliar streets to the hospital, following the GPS instructions that Heather had insisted they purchase last year. "You can't keep using paper maps forever, Dad. It's the digital age." They found Heather's room on the maternity floor, where her husband Mark greeted them with visible relief. "Thank God you're here. She's been asking for you." Heather lay in the hospital bed, her face flushed with exertion, her hair damp with sweat. Despite the evident pain, she smiled at the sight of her parents. "You made it," she said, reaching for her mother's hand. "Of course we did," Nancy said, bending to kiss her daughter's forehead. "We wouldn't miss this for the world." Harold stood awkwardly at the foot of the bed, overwhelmed by the medical equipment, the unfamiliar environment, and the visceral reality of his daughter in labor. This was women's territory, he thought, a mystery he had no part in. Then Heather's eyes found his. "Dad," she said, extending her other hand, "I'm so glad you're here." He moved to her side, taking her offered hand. It felt small in his, though no longer with the smallness of childhood. This was a woman's hand, capable and strong, now squeezing his with surprising force as a contraction seized her. "Sorry," she gasped as the pain subsided. "Don't apologize," he said gruffly. "You squeeze as hard as you need to." The labor progressed through the evening and into the night. Harold and Nancy took turns sitting with Heather, while Mark remained constantly at her side. During his breaks, Harold paced the hospital corridors, watching other families in their own moments of crisis or joy. Life continuing, unfolding in all its complexity despite the personal earthquakes that shook individual worlds. At 3:17 a.m., after 16 hours of labor, Heather gave birth to a daughter, 7 pounds 4 ounces. Perfect in every way, Harold stood beside Nancy as the nurse placed the swaddled infant in Heather's arms. The sight struck him with unexpected force, his child holding her child, the continuation of life despite all the endings happening around them. "Do you want to hold your granddaughter, Grandpa?" Heather asked, her exhaustion giving way to radiant joy. Harold hesitated, suddenly aware of his large, calloused hands. Hands that had operated machinery, handled tools, built things. Could they be gentle enough for this tiny new life? But Heather was already passing the bundle to him, and then his granddaughter was in his arms, impossibly light and yet somehow heavier than anything he'd ever carried. He looked down at her red, wrinkled face, the delicate eyelashes, the perfect miniature fingers. "She's beautiful," he whispered, afraid to speak at normal volume lest he disturb this miracle. "What's her name?" Heather and Mark exchanged a glance. "We're naming her Alina," Heather said, "after Mom's mother." Nancy's eyes filled with tears. "Oh, sweetheart." And Heather continued, her gaze shifting to Harold. "Her middle name is Harriet, after her grandfather." Harold stared at his daughter, unable to speak. The honor of it, the recognition, left him without words. "We wanted her to carry both your names," Mark explained. "To know where she comes from." "Alina Harriet Turner," Harold said finally, testing the name as he gazed at his granddaughter's face. "It's perfect." In that moment, holding this new life in his arms, Harold felt something shift inside him, a recalibration of what mattered, of what defined value and purpose. The mill was ending, an era was closing. But here was continuation, renewal, hope embodied in 7 pounds, 4 ounces of new possibility. For the first time since the closure announcement, Harold felt something besides loss, not acceptance, not yet. But a glimmer of perspective that suggested there might be life, meaningful life, beyond what he had always known. They stayed in Cincinnati for 3 days, helping Heather and Mark adjust to parenthood, assembling the cradle in the nursery, performing the small tasks that new parents have no time for. Harold found unexpected satisfaction in these simple acts of service, fixing a loose cabinet door in the kitchen, installing the car seat base, organizing the garage that Mark had never quite gotten around to setting up properly. It wasn't papermaking, it wasn't what he had done for nearly 4 decades, but it was useful work, necessary work. It mattered to people he loved. On their final evening, as Nancy helped Heather with the baby's bath, Mark joined Harold on the back deck. They sat in silence for a while, watching the October dusk settle over the suburban neighborhood. "Thank you for everything you've done these past few days," Mark said eventually. "It's been a huge help." Harold nodded, uncomfortable with gratitude as always. "It's nothing." "It's not nothing," Mark turned to face his father-in-law directly. "Look, I know this is a difficult time with the mill closing. Heather's been worried sick about you too." Harold shifted in his chair. "She doesn't need to worry about us, we'll be fine." "I'm sure you will," Mark agreed, "but I wanted you to know. If you and Nancy ever wanted to relocate to Cincinnati, we'd love to have you closer. There are nice communities here, affordable ones." The suggestion landed like a stone in still water, rippling outward with implications. Leave Springfield. Start over somewhere new, be near Alina as she grew. "That's kind of you," Harold said carefully, "but Springfield is our home." Mark nodded, not pressing the point. The offer stands whenever, no expiration date. Later that night, as they prepared for bed in the guest room, Harold mentioned the conversation to Nancy. "Mark suggested we might consider moving to Cincinnati," he said, watching her reaction closely, "to be near Alina." Nancy paused in applying lotion to her hands, a nightly ritual to ease her arthritis. "What did you say?" "I said Springfield is our home." She nodded, resuming her methodical application of lotion. "It is." "But," Harold prompted, sensing an unspoken thought. "No, but," she said, "Springfield is our home. Has been all our lives." She rubbed lotion between her fingers, working it into the painful joints. "Though I have to admit, being close to Alina is tempting." Harold sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly weary. "Everything's changing, Nan. The mill, the town, now we're grandparents." He shook his head. "Sometimes I feel like I'm losing my footing, like nothing is solid anymore." Nancy crossed to him, placing her hands on his shoulders. "Change doesn't have to mean loss, Harry. It can also mean new beginnings. At our age. Especially at our age," she said firmly. "We've earned the right to reimagine our lives, haven't we?" Harold thought of Jennifer Wilson's question at the community meeting. What kind of city do we want Springfield to be? Perhaps the more immediate question was, what kind of life did they want for themselves now, with all the old certainties stripped away? I don't know how to start over, he admitted, the words difficult to speak aloud. None of us do, Nancy said gently, but we figure it out, one day at a time, remember. His own words echoed back to him, one day at a time. It had been empty platitude when he first said it. Now, perhaps, it was the only truth worth holding onto. They returned to Springfield the next day. As they crossed the city limits, Harold felt the weight of reality settling back onto his shoulders. Tomorrow was October 15th, his last official day at the mill, the end of the life he had known since he was 18 years old. The house seemed unnaturally quiet after the lively chaos of Heather and Mark's home with a newborn. Harold carried their bags upstairs, then stood in the bedroom doorway, surveying the space they had shared for decades. The familiar furniture, the faded wallpaper they kept meaning to replace, the photographs on the dresser documenting their life together. It was home. But for the first time, he allowed himself to wonder if it might someday not be. The phone rang, jarring him from his thoughts. Nancy answered downstairs, then called up to him. "Harry, it's Mike." Harold took the extension in the bedroom. "Mike, everything okay?" "Did you hear?" Mike's voice was agitated. "About the mill." "What about it?" Harold felt a spike of anxiety. "I've been out of town, my daughter had her baby." "Oh, congratulations," Mike said, momentarily distracted. "Boy or girl?" "Girl, Elena." "But what about the mill, Mike?" "They've accelerated the shutdown. Everything's closing by the end of the month. They're offering additional severance if people leave voluntarily before then." Harold sat heavily on the bed. "Why the rush?" "Orders dried up faster than they projected. No point keeping the lights on. They're telling everyone at shift change today." After hanging up, Harold stood at the bedroom window, looking out at the neighborhood where he'd lived most of his adult life. In the fading October light, he could see signs of decline he'd been ignoring: the Martin house with its peeling paint, the overgrown yard at the Collins place since Jack Collins had his stroke, the for sale sign that had stood in front of the Reynolds house for over a year now. Springfield was struggling, had been struggling for years while he focused only on his own steady path at the mill. Now that path was ending, and he had to see the city as it actually was, not as it had been in some golden past that perhaps had never really existed as he remembered it. "Harry," Nancy called from downstairs. "Everything all right?" "Fine," he answered automatically, coming down. But everything was not fine, and pretending otherwise no longer served any purpose. The truth was that Harold Tanner, at 60 years old, was about to become unemployed for the first time in his adult life. The identity that had defined him, papermaker, provider, steady worker, was being stripped away, leaving him to face the most fundamental question of all. Who was he if not the man who worked at the mill? Harold's last day at Champion International Paper Company dawned clear and cool, a perfect October morning that seemed to mock the solemnity of the occasion. He rose at his usual time, 4:30 a.m., though there was no longer any need. Force of habit, he told himself. Structure was important, especially now. He made coffee and prepared his lunch: ham sandwich on white bread, apple, thermos of coffee. Nancy found him at the kitchen table, staring at the lunch pail he had carried to work for decades. "You don't have to go, you know," she said gently. "You could call in, use your personal time. No one would blame you." Harold shook his head. "I've never called in when I could work. I'm not starting now." "It's not really work anymore, Harry. It's saying goodbye." "Then I'll say goodbye properly. Face to face." He kissed her cheek and left, just as he had thousands of mornings before. The drive to the mill took exactly 12 minutes. The parking lot was half empty, many workers having already accepted the accelerated severance offer or simply not bothering to show up for the final days. Harold parked in his usual spot and walked through the gates for the last time as an employee. The security guard, a young man who had started just a few years ago, nodded in recognition. "Morning, Mr. Tanner." "Morning, Jeff." Harold hesitated, then added, "Last day." Jeff's expression softened with sympathy. "Sorry to hear that, sir. You've been here longer than most." 37 years, Harold confirmed. "Not as long as my father." He put in 41. "That's something to be proud of," Jeff said, sounding like he meant it. Harold nodded and continued into the facility. The mill felt like a body with its life force ebbing away, machines silenced, areas darkened, the workforce reduced to a skeleton crew performing the final tasks of closing down operations. At his station, the Fourdrinier machine stood silent, already decommissioned. Harold had missed its final shutdown while in Cincinnati. Now it was just a massive arrangement of metal and machinery, no longer the living, breathing entity he had tended for so long. He ran his hand along its surface, feeling the coolness where once there had been warmth, the stillness where there had been constant motion. In this machine's operation, he had found purpose, identity, meaning. With its shutdown, a piece of himself had also been stilled. The day passed in a blur of paperwork, final checks, and awkward goodbyes. HR provided a packet with information about his pension, continuing health coverage, and resources for finding new employment. A supervisor he barely knew thanked him for his service to the company. Coworkers who remained shook his hand or clapped him on the shoulder, murmuring platitudes about keeping in touch, about better days ahead. By 3 p.m., everything that could be said had been said, everything that needed signing had been signed. Harold stood in the locker room for the last time, changing out of his work clothes into the street clothes he had arrived in. His locker, which had held his personal items for decades, was now empty, its contents packed into a cardboard box that sat on the bench beside him. Mike appeared as Harold was closing the locker door. "Thought I'd catch you before you left." Harold turned to face his friend. "Your last day too." Mike nodded, taking the accelerated severance, no point dragging it out. They stood in silence for a moment, two men who had worked side by side for 30 years, now facing a future neither had planned for. "What will you do?" Harold asked finally. Mike shrugged. "Applied for a maintenance position at the hospital. Pays not great, but it's something. You?" "Haven't decided yet." The admission felt like failure. "We should get a beer sometime," Mike said. "Not at O'Reilly's though, too many ghosts." "Sure," Harold agreed, though both men knew it might never happen. Without the mill binding them together, their paths might never cross again. They shook hands, a firm, lingering clasp that conveyed what words could not. Then Mike was gone, and Harold was alone in the locker room that had been part of his daily routine for most of his life. He picked up his box of personal items and walked through the mill one last time. The sounds were all wrong now, too quiet, too hollow. This place that had hummed with activity 24/7 for over a century was winding down to silence, its purpose ended, its future uncertain. At the security gate, Jeff stopped him to check the contents of his box, standard procedure for exiting workers. It was a final indignity, a reminder that even after 37 years, the company's trust had limits. "Sorry, Mr. Tanner, have to check everyone." Harold nodded stiffly. The box contained little of value, a few tools he'd purchased himself, family photos that had decorated his locker, a Champion International coffee mug given for his 25th anniversary with the company. "All clear," Jeff said, stepping back. "Take care, sir." "You too, Jeff, good luck." In the parking lot, Harold placed the box on the passenger seat of his pickup and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. From this vantage point, he could see the mill sprawled across its vast acreage, smokestacks rising against the autumn sky. Only one still emitted the white plume that had been a constant feature of Springfield's skyline for generations. Soon, that too would be gone. Harold started the truck and drove away from the mill for the last time as an employee. 37 years of his life left behind in a facility that would soon stand empty, perhaps to be demolished, perhaps to be repurposed, but never again to be what it had been, the economic heart of Springfield, the provider of good jobs and stable futures for thousands of workers. The drive home took exactly 12 minutes, as always. But when Harold pulled into the driveway, he couldn't bring himself to go inside immediately. Instead, he sat in the truck, still trying to absorb the reality of what had just happened. He was no longer a papermaker, he was no longer employed. He was no longer defined by the work that had structured his days, his years, his identity for nearly 4 decades. Who was he now? The front door opened and Nancy appeared on the porch, watching him with concern. Harold gathered the box from the passenger seat and got out of the truck, straightening his shoulders as if preparing for physical labor. "It's done," he said simply as he approached. Nancy didn't respond with words. She simply opened her arms and Harold stepped into her embrace, the box awkward between them. For a moment they stood there on the porch of the home they had purchased with his mill wages, holding each other as the October sun slanted low through the trees. "Come inside," Nancy said finally. "I made your favorite dinner." "It's only 4 o'clock," Harold pointed out. "I know, but it seemed like a day for breaking routine." Inside, the smell of pot roast filled the kitchen, comforting and familiar. Harold set his box on the counter and washed his hands at the sink, a lifelong habit after work, except it wasn't after work anymore. It was just after. "We should celebrate," Nancy said, the forced brightness in her voice not quite masking her concern. "The start of a new chapter." Harold dried his hands on the kitchen towel. "Is that what this is?" "A celebration." "It can be," she said carefully, "if we choose to see it that way." He didn't respond, turning instead to look out the kitchen window at the backyard where he had taught Heather to ride a bike, where they had hosted summer barbecues for other mill families, where he had built the deck with his own hands during a 2-week vacation in 1987. "I don't know how to celebrate becoming unemployed at 60, he said finally. "I don't know how to find meaning in that." Nancy moved to stand beside him at the window. "Your worth isn't in your job, Harry." "It never was." "Easy to say, harder to believe." "I know," she touched his arm, "but it's true, you are so much more than what you did for a living." Harold wanted to believe her. But the truth was his identity had been so thoroughly entwined with his work that separating the two seemed impossible. He had been Harold Tanner, papermaker. Now he was, what? A retiree, an unemployed worker, a has-been. "I need some time," he said, moving away from the window, "to figure things out." "Of course," Nancy's voice held no judgment, only understanding. "Take all the time you need. I'm here." That evening, they ate pot roast at the dining room table instead of in front of the television. They didn't discuss the mill or the future. Instead, Nancy showed him new pictures of Alina that Heather had texted, and they talked about when they might visit Cincinnati again. "Maybe for Thanksgiving," Harold suggested, "if Mark doesn't mind having us." "He already invited us," Nancy said. "Heather texted me yesterday." Harold nodded, grateful for the invitation, for the sense of being wanted and needed somewhere, even if it wasn't at the mill anymore. After dinner, he retreated to his workshop, seeking the comfort of tools and wood, of creating something with his hands. But as he stood among his projects, the bookshelves for the living room, the coffee table he had made from oak salvaged from his parents' old farmhouse, the birdhouses he built each spring, he felt oddly disconnected from this space that had always been his sanctuary. Without the counterbalance of his work at the mill, his hobby felt frivolous, indulgent. What was the point of making things with no purpose beyond personal satisfaction? What value did it have? Harold left the workshop without touching a tool and went to bed early, claiming fatigue. But sleep eluded him, his mind racing with questions he had no answers for, fears he couldn't articulate even to himself. Around midnight, he gave up and went downstairs to the living room, where he sat in his recliner in the dark. The house was quiet except for the ticking of the mantel clock and the occasional creak of settling wood. For the first time, Harold allowed himself to consider the possibility that life as he had known it was truly over. Not just his job, but the entire social and economic structure that had supported families like his for generations. The promise of stable employment in exchange for hard work and loyalty, the dignity of manufacturing, the pride in making tangible products. All of it was disappearing, not just in Springfield but across America. And men like him, men who had believed in the promise, who had built their lives around it, were being left behind, their skills devalued, their contributions forgotten. The realization brought not anger but a profound sadness. Harold sat in the darkness, mourning not just his job but an entire way of life that seemed to be vanishing before his eyes. Eventually, exhaustion overcame him and he fell asleep in the recliner. Nancy found him there in the morning, covered him with a blanket, and let him sleep. The first weeks of unemployment passed in a blur of bureaucratic tasks. Harold filed for benefits, met with the pension administrator, reviewed health insurance options. He organized his home office, updated his resume with help from the outplacement service, attended a workshop on navigating career transition after 50. The workshop was held at the community college and attended by 24 former mill workers, most in their 50s or 60s. The instructor, a young woman with relentless enthusiasm, presented slides about transferable skills and personal branding and the digital job search. Harold sat in the back row, taking notes dutifully but feeling increasingly disconnected from the material. What transferable skills did a 60-year-old papermaker possess in an economy that valued digital expertise and advanced degrees? What did personal branding mean to a man who had never needed to market himself because good jobs had been available to anyone willing to work hard? The key is to reinvent yourself, the instructor said brightly, to see this as an opportunity, not an ending. Beside Harold, Dave Simmons muttered under his breath, easy for her to say. She's what, 30, with a college degree. Try reinventing yourself when you've got arthritis and a mortgage and nobody wants to hire you. Harold nodded in silent agreement. The gap between the cheerful rhetoric of career transition and the harsh reality facing men like him seemed unbridgeable. After the workshop, he drove downtown to the employment office to check on his benefits claim. Springfield's Main Street, once the vibrant center of commerce, now displayed more vacant storefronts than occupied ones. The Grand Wren's department store building, where his mother had taken him shopping for school clothes, stood empty and decaying, its windows covered with plywood. The employment office occupied a drab government building near the courthouse. Inside, Harold took a number and waited among dozens of others seeking assistance. Some were clearly former mill workers, he recognized faces from various departments. Others were younger, their expressions ranging from bored to desperate. When his number was finally called, Harold approached the counter where a tired-looking woman in her 40s processed his paperwork with mechanical efficiency. "Your claim is in process," she said, checking her computer. "Should see the first payment within 10 business days. You'll need to certify weekly that you're actively seeking employment." "And if there are no jobs to apply for?" Harold asked. The woman looked up, meeting his eyes briefly. "You need to make at least 3 job contacts per week to maintain eligibility. They don't have to be in your field." "I've worked in paper manufacturing for 37 years, Harold said. "That's my field." "I understand, sir," her voice softened slightly. "But with the mill closed, you may need to consider other options. We have listings for retail, food service, custodial." "Minimum wage jobs," Harold interrupted. "With no benefits, how is a man my age supposed to live on that?" She had no answer, just a sympathetic look that somehow made things worse. Harold took the paperwork she offered and left, feeling both angry and ashamed. Angry at a system that had abandoned workers like him, ashamed at needing help in the first place. In the weeks that followed, Harold established a new routine, not by choice but by necessity. He scanned job listings daily, applied for positions he knew he wouldn't get, kept meticulous records of his job search activities to maintain his benefits. He attended more workshops, networked with other displaced workers, explored retraining opportunities. But beneath these activities lay a growing sense of futility. The jobs that matched his experience and skill set were disappearing across the country, not just in Springfield. The positions that were available either required technical skills he didn't possess or paid so poorly that they seemed like charity rather than employment. At home, tensions simmered beneath the surface. Harold and Nancy maintained their careful politeness, their decades of marriage having taught them to navigate difficult waters without capsizing. But the strain showed in small ways: Nancy's increased focus on household economies, Harold's withdrawal into silent brooding, conversations that trailed off unfinished. One evening in late November, as they prepared for their Thanksgiving trip to Cincinnati, Harold found Nancy at the kitchen table with a notepad and calculator, her reading glasses perched on her nose. "What are you working on?" he asked, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Just the monthly budget," she said, not looking up, making some adjustments. Harold glanced at the notepad, seeing columns of numbers and items crossed out. "What kind of adjustments?" Nancy removed her glasses and rubbed the bridge of her nose. "We need to reduce expenses, Harry. The severance is good, but it won't last forever. And your unemployment benefits are less than half what you were making." The reality of their financial situation, laid out in Nancy's neat handwriting, hit Harold with unexpected force. They weren't destitute, they had savings, the severance package, eventually his pension. but the comfortable margin they had lived with for decades was eroding rapidly. "What are you cutting?" he asked, sitting across from her. "Cable TV for one. We can switch to basic. The lawn service, you're home now so you can do it yourself." "I've called about refinancing the mortgage to lower the payments." She hesitated. "And I think we should consider selling one of the cars. We don't really need two anymore." Each item felt like a personal rebuke. Of course he could mow the lawn himself now. Of course they didn't need two cars when he no longer commuted to work. Of course they should economize on luxuries like cable TV, but the implications stung nonetheless. This was what unemployment meant: a slow diminishment, a paring back, a life made smaller. "We'll manage," Nancy added, perhaps seeing his expression. "We've been through tight times before." It was true. Early in their marriage, when Heather was small and the interest rates on their first home had climbed to nearly 18%, they had scraped by on careful budgeting and occasional help from family. But that had been different. They had been young then, with their whole working lives ahead of them. The tight times had been temporary, a phase to endure until things improved. Now, at 60, Harold faced a different reality. This wasn't a temporary setback but a permanent diminishment. The good jobs weren't coming back. The mill wasn't reopening. The skills he had spent a lifetime developing were no longer valued in an economy that increasingly rewarded different kinds of work. "I'll start looking for something again after the holidays," he said, trying to sound confident. "Even part-time would help." Nancy reached across the table to take his hand. "I know you will, but in the meantime we adjust." "That's all I'm saying." Harold nodded, squeezing her hand gently. "Whatever we need to do." Later that night, as Nancy slept beside him, Harold lay awake contemplating the subtle shift in their relationship. For nearly 4 decades, he had been the provider, the breadwinner, the one whose income had made their life possible. Now they were drawing on shared resources, savings they had built together, equity in a home they both owned, eventually a pension he had earned, but that belonged to both of them. The change shouldn't have bothered him. They were partners after all. Had been since they stood before the altar at First Presbyterian in 1966 and promised to support each other in plenty and in want. But it did bother him. Because for Harold Tanner, providing wasn't just something he did, it was who he was. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "A man provides, that's what men do." What was he if not a provider? What defined him if not the ability to support his family through his labor? These questions followed him to Cincinnati the next day, where they celebrated Thanksgiving with Heather, Mark, and 2-month-old Alina. The baby had grown surprisingly in the weeks since they had last seen her, her features more defined, her awareness of the world around her more evident. Harold found unexpected peace in holding her, in watching her wide eyes track movements around the room, in feeling her tiny fingers grip his much larger ones with surprising strength. In Alina, he saw continuation, life moving forward despite endings and losses. She would grow up in a world very different from the one he had known, but perhaps that was as it should be. "She likes you, Dad," Heather said, watching them from the kitchen doorway. "She doesn't settle down for just anyone like that." Harold smiled, gently rocking his granddaughter. "Must be the grandpa touch." "Must be." Heather sat beside him on the couch. "How are things in Springfield, really?" Harold considered deflecting, giving his standard fine response. But something in Heather's direct gaze, so like her mother's when Nancy wanted the unvarnished truth, made him hesitate. "Difficult," he admitted finally. "The mill's completely shut down now, downtown's like a ghost town. People are leaving if they can. And you. How are you doing with everything?" Harold looked down at Alina, who had fallen asleep against his chest, her tiny body completely relaxed in trust. "I'm adjusting. It's not easy, starting over at my age." "You know you and Mom could move here," Heather said carefully. "There's that nice ranch house for sale just 3 streets over. Single level would be good for Mom's arthritis. And you'd be close enough to see Alina every day." The offer was tempting in ways Harold hadn't expected. The thought of watching his granddaughter grow, of being a regular presence in her life rather than a visitor from 2 hours away, pulled at something deep inside him. "Your mother might like that," he said noncommittally. "And you." Harold sighed. I don't know, Heather. Springfield is home, has been all my life, even with everything changing, it's still mine in a way no other place could be. I understand, she said, though he wondered if she really could. Heather had left Springfield right after college and never looked back. The city represented her past, not her present or future. Just know the option is there, whatever you decide. On the drive back to Springfield the following day, Harold broached the subject with Nancy. Heather mentioned that house for sale near them again. Nancy glanced at him, surprised. Did she? What did you say? That you might like it, being closer to Eleanor. And you wouldn't. There was no challenge in her tone, just curiosity. Harold kept his eyes on the road, watching the Ohio landscape roll past, fields harvested for the winter, small towns with their water towers and church steeples, the occasional factory standing silent where once there had been activity. I've been thinking about it, he said carefully, about what it would mean to leave Springfield. And I'm not sure I know who I am outside of that place. The mill, the house, the workshop, they've defined me for so long. If I leave all that behind, what's left? Nancy was quiet for a moment, considering. You'd still be you, Harry, the same man I've loved for 50 years, the same father Heather adores, the same grandfather Eleanor will grow up knowing. None of that changes with geography. Doesn't it? He glanced at her briefly. We are what we do, where we live, the communities we're part of. Change all that, and something fundamental changes too. Maybe that's not entirely bad, Nancy suggested gently. Maybe change is what we need at this point in our lives. Harold didn't respond immediately. The thought of leaving Springfield, of selling the house they had lived in for decades, of saying goodbye to neighbors and friends, of abandoning the city where he had spent his entire life, filled him with a complex mixture of fear and something else he couldn't quite identify. Relief, possibility. I'm not saying we should decide right away, Nancy added, just that we should consider all our options, keep an open mind. I'll try, Harold promised, though he wasn't sure how successful he would be. Open-mindedness had never been his strong suit. He had always preferred certainty, stability, the known path, but now the path ahead was anything but certain, and he was being asked to consider possibilities he had never imagined for himself. It was disorienting, unsettling, and yet, as they crossed back into Springfield's city limits, Harold found himself seeing his hometown with new eyes, not just as the place he had always been, but as a place he might someday choose to leave behind. The thought was both terrifying and strangely liberating. December brought colder temperatures and a deepening sense of stasis. Springfield seemed to hibernate under gray skies, its economic wounds hidden beneath a blanket of occasional snow. The mill stood silent and dark, its smokestacks now permanent fixtures against the winter horizon, no longer belching steam and smoke into the air. Harold continued his job search with diminishing expectations. He had one interview at a hardware store, but the position went to someone younger. He applied at the hospital for a maintenance position similar to the one Mike had mentioned, but never heard back. The community college offered courses in computer skills for displaced workers, and he considered enrolling, but couldn't see how basic computing knowledge would make him more employable at 60. The days developed their own rhythm, different from his working life but structured nonetheless. He rose early out of habit, made coffee, read the newspaper. He checked job listings online using the computer Heather had insisted they buy last year. He performed household tasks that had previously been weekend projects, fixing the leaky faucet in the bathroom, repainting the guest bedroom, organizing the garage. In the workshop he started new projects, a set of nesting tables for the living room, a jewelry box for Nancy's birthday in February, toy blocks for Eleanor. The work satisfied something in him, the need to create, to shape materials with his hands, to produce tangible results from his labor. One afternoon, as Harold was sanding the jewelry box in his workshop, the doorbell rang. Nancy was at her weekly arthritis support group, so he wiped the sawdust from his hands and went to answer it. On the porch stood Jennifer Wilson, the high school English teacher who had spoken at the community meeting back in September. She held a folder and looked slightly nervous. Mr. Tanner, I'm Jennifer Wilson, I don't know if you remember me. From the community meeting, Harold said, recognizing her, about reimagining Springfield's future. She smiled, relieved. Yes, exactly. I'm sorry to drop by unannounced, but I've been trying to contact former mill workers for a project, and you weren't listed in the phone book. We've had the same number for 30 years, Harold said. But it's under my wife's name. Nancy Tanner. That explains it. Jennifer shifted the folder to her other arm. May I come in, just for a few minutes? I'd like to tell you about what we're doing. Harold hesitated, then nodded, sure. Come on in. He led her to the living room, uncomfortable with the role of host during daytime hours when he would normally have been at work. Can I get you something? Coffee. Water. Water would be great, thanks. When he returned from the kitchen with 2 glasses of water, Jennifer was looking at the family photos on the mantel, Harold and Nancy on their 25th anniversary, Heather's college graduation, a recent addition showing Harold holding newborn Alina. Beautiful family, she said as he handed her the water. Thank you. Harold sat in his recliner, gesturing for her to take the sofa. You mentioned a project. Jennifer set down her water and opened the folder. Yes. After the community meeting in September, a group of us started talking about ways to document Springfield's industrial history before it's lost. The paper mills have been such a central part of this city's identity for over a century, and now that they're closed, we're concerned that the knowledge, the stories, the experiences of the workers might disappear too. Harold nodded, unsure where this was leading, but interested nonetheless. We're calling it the Springfield Industrial Heritage Project, Jennifer continued. We're collecting oral histories from former mill workers, factory employees, anyone who was part of Springfield's manufacturing past. We're recording interviews, gathering photographs, collecting artifacts. She paused. Your name came up several times as someone who might have valuable perspectives to share. Me, Harold was genuinely surprised. Why? You worked at the mill for how long? 37 years, and my father worked there for 41 before me. Exactly, Jennifer said, leaning forward slightly. That's nearly 80 years of combined experience in one of Springfield's most important industries. Your knowledge is invaluable, Mr. Tanner, and if we don't capture it now, it could be lost forever. Harold considered this. He had never thought of his work experience as historically significant, as something worth preserving. It was just what he did, what most men in Springfield did: work at the mills or the factories, earn a living, support a family. What would I have to do? He asked finally. We'd like to record an interview with you about your experiences at the mill, your daily work, the changes you saw over the years, what the job meant to you. We're also interested in photographs, documents, any physical items that help tell the story. She handed him several pages from her folder, a project description, consent forms, sample interview questions. Harold scanned them, noting the university and historical society logos at the top. What's the purpose of all this? He asked, beyond just recording the information. Jennifer set down her water glass. 2 main purposes. First, preservation, making sure this important part of Springfield's history isn't lost. Second, education, helping future generations understand what manufacturing meant to communities like ours and what was lost when it disappeared. The second purpose gave Harold pause. There was something almost archaeological about it, as if they were documenting a civilization that had vanished rather than one that had been deliberately dismantled while still viable. Sounds like you're cataloging dinosaur bones, he said, more sharply than he intended, studying extinct creatures. Jennifer didn't flinch at his tone. In a way, we are. American manufacturing as it existed for most of the 20th century is largely gone, Mr. Tanner. We can debate whether that should have happened, but the reality is that it did happen. And if we don't preserve the knowledge and experiences of the people who lived it, future generations won't understand what was lost. Her directness disarmed him. She wasn't pretending the mills might reopen, that manufacturing might return to Springfield in its previous form. She was acknowledging the reality he had been struggling to accept himself. I'll think about it, he said, setting the papers on the coffee table. That's all I ask. Jennifer stood, preparing to leave. My contact information is on those forms. Call me if you have questions or if you decide to participate. She paused at the door. And Mr. Tanner, for what it's worth, I think the knowledge you carry, not just about papermaking, but about what it meant to be part of that world, is incredibly valuable. not as a relic but as living wisdom. After she left, Harold returned to the workshop but found himself unable to focus on the jewelry box. Jennifer's visit had stirred something in him, a recognition that while his working life had ended, the knowledge and experience he had accumulated over nearly 4 decades hadn't disappeared. It remained within him, as tangible in its way as the paper he had helped produce for so many years. The question was, did that knowledge have any value in a world that no longer made paper in Springfield, Ohio? When Nancy returned from her support group, Harold told her about Jennifer's visit and the Springfield Industrial Heritage Project. "I think you should do it," Nancy said immediately, surprising him with her certainty. "Why?" "Because you have something important to share, Harry, something that's part of you, part of this community's history," she touched his arm, "and because it might help you make sense of everything that's happened." Harold considered this. Perhaps there was value in articulating his experiences, in placing them within the larger context of Springfield's industrial rise and decline. Perhaps the act of telling his story would help him understand it better himself. "I'll think about it," he said again, the same response he had given Jennifer, but this time he meant it. The next morning, Harold pulled Jennifer's papers from the coffee table where he had left them and read through them more carefully. The project seemed well-organized and serious in its intentions. The interview questions were thoughtful, covering not just the technical aspects of papermaking but the social and personal dimensions of mill work. On impulse, he picked up the phone and dialed the number listed on the contact sheet. "Jennifer Wilson," she answered on the third ring. "Ms. Wilson, this is Harold Tanner, about your project." 2 days later, Harold found himself sitting in the living room with Jennifer and a young man named Marcus who operated the recording equipment. They had set up microphones and were testing sound levels while Harold nervously arranged and rearranged the items he had gathered for the interview: photographs of himself and his father at the mill, his employee ID badges from different eras, several samples of paper produced at the Springfield facility over the years. "Just try to relax, Mr. Tanner," Jennifer advised as Marcus adjusted a microphone. "Think of this as a conversation, not a formal interview. We can stop any time you want, take breaks, go back over things. And we'll give you a copy of the recording and transcript to review before anything becomes part of the public archive." Harold nodded, trying to calm his inexplicable nervousness. He had never considered himself particularly articulate. At the mill, he had been known as a man of few words, someone who spoke when necessary but preferred to let his work speak for itself. "Ready whenever you are," Marcus said, giving a thumbs up. Jennifer smiled encouragingly at Harold. "Let's start with something simple. Can you tell us when you began working at the Champion Mill, and what led you to that job?" Harold took a deep breath and began to speak. "I started at Champion International in June of 1966, right after graduating high school. But really, my connection to the mill began much earlier. My father, William Tanner, worked there from 1945 until 1986, 41 years. The mill was part of our family conversation as far back as I can remember." Once he began talking, the nervousness faded. Harold found himself recalling details he hadn't thought about in years: his father coming home with the particular smell of the mill clinging to his clothes, the first time he toured the facility as a teenager, the mix of intimidation and excitement he felt on his first day of work. "The noise was what struck me first," he told Jennifer. "The constant roar of the machines, the hiss of steam, the rumble of the pulper. It was overwhelming at first, but eventually it became like a second heartbeat. You didn't even hear it anymore unless something changed in the sound, and then every experienced worker would instantly know something was wrong." As the interview progressed, Harold moved from describing the physical realities of the mill to the social aspects: the camaraderie among workers, the hierarchy of skills and positions, the pride in producing something tangible and necessary. "We made paper," he said simply. "It doesn't sound glamorous, but think about it: paper for books, for newspapers, for packaging, for communication. The modern world runs on paper, even now with all the digital technology. And we made it with our hands and our knowledge and our care for quality." Jennifer nodded encouragingly. "Can you talk about how the work changed over the years, the technology, the processes?" Harold described the evolution he had witnessed, from largely mechanical systems to computer-controlled operations, from hands-on adjustments to digital monitoring. He talked about the gradual reduction in workforce as automation increased, the changing skill sets required, the shift from physical labor to technical knowledge. But the heart of it stayed the same, he insisted. The basic process of turning pulp into paper, the need for human judgment, human senses, human experience to ensure quality. A machine can monitor gauges, but it takes a person to hear when something doesn't sound right, to smell when the chemistry is off, to feel when a roller needs adjustment. The conversation turned to the economic and social significance of the mill in Springfield. Harold described how the paper industry had supported generations of families, provided middle-class incomes for workers without college degrees, funded the tax base that built schools and parks and public services. The mill made Springfield possible, he said, echoing his father's words. Not just economically but socially, it gave people stability, purpose, community. When you know your job is secure, when you can plan for the future, you invest differently in your town. You build a life, not just make a living. The interview lasted nearly 3 hours with several breaks for water and rest. By the end, Harold felt emotionally drained but also oddly satisfied, as if he had completed an important task. He had given voice to experiences that mattered, had articulated the value of work that might otherwise be forgotten or dismissed as obsolete. "Thank you, Mr. Tanner," Jennifer said as Marcus packed up the recording equipment. "That was incredibly valuable. You've given us insights we couldn't have gotten any other way." Harold nodded, suddenly self-conscious again. "Hope it was what you needed." "It was exactly what we needed," she assured him. "And I hope it was meaningful for you as well." After they left, Harold sat alone in the living room, surrounded by the artifacts of his working life that he had gathered for the interview. The employee badges with his progressively older face staring back, the certificates of recognition for years of service, the samples of paper, newsprint, book stock, cardboard that represented the tangible results of his labor. For the first time since the mill's closure, Harold felt a glimmer of pride untainted by loss. Yes, the mill was gone. Yes, his working life as he had known it was over, but what he had done, what he had known, what he had been part of, that remained. And perhaps, through projects like Jennifer's, some essence of that experience would continue into a future he could not yet imagine. Nancy found him there when she returned from grocery shopping. She set down her bags and sat beside him on the sofa, looking at the items spread across the coffee table. "How did it go?" she asked. "Good, I think," Harold replied. "Better than I expected." "I'm glad." She picked up one of the employee badges, studying his much younger face. "You know what occurred to me at the store today? That we've spent our entire lives preparing for a future that looked like our past. Assuming things would continue as they always had, and now we're being asked to imagine something completely different." Harold considered this. That's pretty much what Jennifer said about Springfield. That we need to reimagine what the city could be, not try to recreate what it was. "Smart woman," Nancy set down the badge. "Maybe the same is true for us. Maybe instead of trying to replace what's gone, we need to imagine something new for ourselves." "Like what?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "That's what we have to figure out together." Harold nodded slowly. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. At 60, they were being asked or forced to reimagine their lives in ways they had never anticipated. It seemed impossible, and yet the alternative, clinging to a past that was irrevocably gone, seemed equally impossible. "One day at a time," he said, returning to the phrase that had sustained him through the past few months. But now it felt less like an empty platitude and more like a genuine approach to their uncertain future. Nancy squeezed his hand. "One day at a time," she agreed, "starting with today." January brought bitterly cold weather and a surprising development. Harold received a call from Jennifer Wilson asking if he would be willing to speak to her senior English class about his experiences at the mill. The class was working on a unit about work, identity, and social change, and she thought his perspective would be valuable. "I'm not much of a public speaker," Harold protested. "Especially to teenagers." "You're exactly what they need to hear," Jennifer insisted. "Most of them have no concept of the manufacturing era that built this town. Their parents have either adapted to the service economy or left Springfield altogether." You can help them understand what's been lost and maybe what could still be possible. Against his better judgment, Harold agreed. On a snowy Tuesday morning, he found himself standing before 25 high school seniors, nervously clearing his throat as Jennifer introduced him. Mr. Tanner worked at the Champion paper mill for 37 years, she explained to the class. His father worked there before him for 41 years. Together, that's nearly 8 decades of experience in an industry that shaped Springfield's development and identity. He's here to share his perspective on work, community, and change. The students regarded him with varying degrees of interest and indifference. Harold had prepared some remarks, but standing before these young people, so different from him in their experiences, their expectations, their understanding of the world, he set aside his notes. "When I was your age," he began, "my future seemed clear. I would graduate high school, get a job at the mill where my father worked, support a family, retire with a pension. That was the path for most young men in Springfield. It offered security, dignity, purpose. And for nearly 4 decades, that's exactly what I did." He described the mill, its sights, sounds, smells, the physical nature of the work, the pride in producing something tangible. The camaraderie among workers who spent their days side by side, year after year, sharing the rhythms of shift work, the satisfaction of meeting production goals, the identity of being mill men. As he spoke, he noticed more students sitting up, their expressions shifting from polite attention to genuine interest. This was a world completely foreign to them, not just from another time but almost from another planet in terms of its values, its assumptions, its promises. The mill provided more than just jobs, Harold continued. It created a particular kind of community. When people work together for decades, when their livelihoods depend on each other, when they share the same struggles and celebrations, they develop connections that go beyond friendship. They become something like family. He described how mill workers looked out for each other, helping when someone was injured or ill, celebrating marriages and births, mourning deaths. How they bought houses in the same neighborhoods, attended the same churches, supported the same local businesses and sports teams. The economic security provided by those jobs allowed people to put down roots, he explained. To invest in their community, to plan for the future. When you know your job is stable, when you can count on a decent income year after year, you make different choices. You build a life, not just make a living. Then he turned to the changes. The gradual automation of processes, the increasing competition from overseas, the corporate mergers and acquisitions that prioritized profit over community stability. He described the final years at the mill, the growing signs of trouble, the eventual announcement of closure. "The hardest part wasn't losing the job itself," he said quietly. "It was losing the sense of purpose, of identity, of being part of something larger than myself. For my entire adult life, I was Harold Tanner, papermaker. When the mill closed, I had to confront a question I'd never really considered before. Who am I without that work?" The class was silent now, all pretense of adolescent indifference gone. These young people, poised to enter a world of work very different from the one Harold had known, seemed to recognize the universal nature of his question. Who are we, if not the work we do? What gives life meaning, if not productive labor? How do we define ourselves in a world where traditional sources of identity are rapidly changing? "I don't have easy answers," Harold admitted. "I'm still figuring it out myself. But I do know this: the work that built this town, manufacturing, making tangible things, had value beyond the paychecks it provided. It gave people a sense of contribution, of craftsmanship, of leaving something real behind. And as we think about Springfield's future, about the kind of work that might sustain this community going forward, we shouldn't lose sight of that fundamental human need to create, to produce, to see the results of our labor." When he finished speaking, there was a moment of silence. Then a hand went up, a girl in the front row with bright blue hair and multiple earrings. "My grandpa worked at Crowell Collier before it closed," she said. "He never really got over it, just kind of gave up." "Do you think that's because his whole identity was wrapped up in his job?" Harold considered the question carefully. "Probably. When you spend decades doing something that you believe matters, that you take pride in, losing that connection can feel like losing yourself. It's hard to start over, to reimagine who you might be." "So how do you avoid that?" asked another student, a serious-looking boy near the back. "How do you keep your job from becoming your whole identity?" The question struck Harold with unexpected force. It was something he had been grappling with himself, though he hadn't articulated it so clearly. "That's a profound question," he said after a moment. "I'm not sure I have a good answer. Perhaps it's about finding meaning in multiple areas of your life. Work, yes, but also family, community, interests outside your job. Remembering that what you do for a living is part of who you are, but not all of who you are." The discussion continued, with students asking thoughtful questions about the economic changes that had transformed Springfield, about the psychological impact of job loss, about the relationship between work and identity in an era of increasing job instability. Harold found himself engaged in a conversation unlike any he had experienced before, across generations, across experiences, across assumptions about the nature of work and life. These young people, with their different haircuts and fashion choices, their smartphones and digital fluency, were trying to make sense of a changing world just as he was, albeit from a very different starting point. When the class period ended, several students lingered to thank him or ask additional questions. One boy, hanging back until the others had gone, approached hesitantly. "Mr. Tanner, my dad worked at the mill too, in maintenance. He's having a really hard time finding another job." Harold recognized the mixture of concern and embarrassment in the boy's expression, the worry for a parent, the discomfort of acknowledging financial struggle. "What's your name?" Harold asked gently. Tyler Johnson." "Is your dad Craig Johnson?" The boy nodded, surprised. "You know him." "We worked different departments, but yes, I knew Craig. Good man, skilled mechanic." Harold paused, considering what might be helpful rather than simply sympathetic. "Tell your dad the hospital is looking for maintenance staff. The pay's not what the mill offered, but it's steady work. And tell him to call me if he wants to talk." Tyler's relief was palpable. "I will, thanks, Mr. Tanner." After the students had filed out, Jennifer approached with a warm smile. "That was extraordinary. You connected with them in a way I haven't seen before." Harold shook his head, still processing the unexpected depth of the discussion. "They're smart kids, asking questions I've been asking myself." "That's why these conversations are so valuable," Jennifer said. "We need to bridge these generational experiences, these different perspectives on work and community. Otherwise, we're all just operating in our separate silos, unable to learn from each other." As Harold drove home, he found himself returning to the student's question. How do you keep your job from becoming your whole identity? It was a question he had never thought to ask during his working years. His job at the mill, his role as provider, his identity as a papermaker, these had seemed like natural, inevitable aspects of who he was, not choices that might be examined or reconsidered. But now, forced by circumstances to reconsider everything, he wondered if there might have been another way to navigate his working life, to find meaning and purpose in his labor without allowing it to define him completely. To prepare for a future in which that particular kind of work might no longer exist. It was too late for such reconsiderations to change his past, of course. But perhaps not too late to influence his future, however much of it remained. At home, Harold found Nancy sorting through old photographs at the kitchen table. She looked up as he entered, her expression curious. "How did it go with the high school students?" "Surprisingly well," he said, hanging up his coat. "They asked good questions." "Made me think." "About what?" Harold sat beside her, picking up one of the photographs, a family portrait taken when Heather was about 10, all three of them dressed in their Sunday best, smiling stiffly for the camera. "About identity, I guess, about how much of who I am was tied to the mill, to that particular kind of work, and what that means now that it's gone." Nancy set down the photo she was holding. "And what did you conclude?" "That I don't know who I am without it," he admitted, "but that I need to figure it out." Nancy nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that too, not just about you but about us, about Springfield. About what comes after the life we've known." She gestured to the photographs spread across the table. "I've been going through these, trying to organize them for Heather. It's made me realize how much our lives have been defined by certain expectations, certain patterns. Work, home, church, community. all built around an economic reality that doesn't exist anymore. Harold picked up another photograph, this one showing him and Nancy on their front porch, probably taken in the late 1980s. They looked confident, established, secure in their place in the world. "I keep thinking about what that student asked you," he said, "about how to avoid having your job become your whole identity. I never even considered that question when I was working. It seemed natural, inevitable, that my work would define me." "For men of your generation it was," Nancy said. "That's what society expected. That's what you were taught from childhood: be a good provider, work hard, support your family. It's not surprising that you internalized those expectations." "But now what?" Harold set down the photograph. "If I'm not a papermaker, not a provider in the same way, then what am I?" Nancy reached across the table to take his hand. "You're still you, Harry, still the man I've loved for 50 years, still Heather's father and Alina's grandfather. Still a skilled craftsman, a thoughtful person, a man of integrity. The mill closing doesn't change any of that." Harold squeezed her hand, grateful for her certainty even as he struggled with his own doubts. "I'm trying to believe that." "I know," Nancy's smile held both sympathy and encouragement, "and I think you're making progress even if you don't see it yourself. The Harold Tanner of 6 months ago would never have agreed to speak to a high school class about his feelings." That made him chuckle despite himself. "True enough. So what's next?" Nancy asked, "after your successful teaching debut?" Harold hadn't planned to mention it yet, but something in Nancy's tone, her openness to possibilities, encouraged him. "Actually, Jennifer asked if I might be interested in being part of a more formal oral history project, recording more detailed interviews, maybe even helping to interview other former mill workers. She thinks my perspective is valuable because I can connect with people who might not open up to academics or outsiders." "That sounds perfect for you," Nancy said immediately. "You've always been good at listening, at drawing people out, and you know the language, the culture, the unspoken realities of mill work in a way no academic ever could." Her enthusiasm surprised him. "You really think so?" "I know so." Nancy gathered the photographs into a neat stack. "And I think it might help you too, help you see that your experience, your knowledge, your perspective still have value even though the mill is closed. That you haven't lost everything just because your job ended." Harold considered this. Perhaps there was something to what Nancy was suggesting. Perhaps by helping to preserve the stories of Springfield's industrial past, he might find a new purpose that honored what had been while contributing to what might come next. "I told her I'd think about it," he said, "but maybe I will say yes." Nancy smiled, one day at a time. "But moving forward, not standing still." "Forward," Harold agreed, "wherever that leads us." February brought heavy snows and a gradual shift in Harold's daily life. He agreed to participate in Jennifer's expanded oral history project, first as an interview subject, then as a liaison helping to identify and recruit other former mill workers who might be willing to share their stories. To his surprise, Harold found himself energized by the work. He contacted former colleagues, explained the project's purpose, reassured them that their experiences mattered and deserved to be preserved. Many were initially reluctant, suspicious of academics, uncomfortable with being recorded, uncertain of the project's value, but Harold's presence made a difference. He wasn't an outsider but one of them, someone who had stood beside them on the mill floor, who understood the culture and language of industrial work, who shared their sense of loss. "We're not just recording history," he explained to Mike Donahue over coffee at the local diner. "We're making sure people understand what manufacturing meant to places like Springfield, what was lost when the mills closed. What might be possible if we could reimagine production for the future." Mike regarded him skeptically. "Sounds like a lot of talk, Harry. Talk doesn't bring jobs back." "No, it doesn't," Harold agreed, "but neither does silence. If we don't tell our stories, if we don't articulate the value of what we did and what we knew, then it just disappears, like it never mattered at all." This argument resonated with many of his former colleagues. They agreed to be interviewed, to share photographs and artifacts, to contribute their perspectives to the growing archive of Springfield's industrial heritage. Harold found himself in a new role, part historian, part community organizer, part bridge between the academic world Jennifer represented and the working-class culture he had always belonged to. It wasn't paid work, but it provided structure to his days, purpose to his efforts, connection to people who shared his experiences and values. At home, he and Nancy continued their careful adjustments to their new financial reality. They refinanced the mortgage, cut unnecessary expenses, sold Harold's pickup truck and kept Nancy's more economical sedan. It wasn't poverty, they had savings, severance, eventually Harold's pension, but it required attention and planning in ways their previous life had not. "We're doing fine," Nancy reassured him when he fretted over the reduced circumstances. "Better than many, we have our health, our home, each other, we have Heather and Mark and Alina. We have enough." Harold tried to embrace this perspective, to focus on what remained rather than what was lost, to find contentment in enough rather than always striving for more. It wasn't easy. His entire life had been shaped by the ethic of productivity, of forward momentum, of defining success through work and material progress. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, he found himself shifting. The days no longer felt empty without the structure of shift work. The purpose he found in the oral history project, in his woodworking, in helping neighbors with repairs and projects, began to fill the void left by the mill's closure. One snowy afternoon in late February, Harold received a phone call from Craig Johnson, the maintenance worker whose son Tyler had approached him after the high school presentation. "Mr. Tanner, this is Craig Johnson. My boy Tyler said I should call you." "Craig, yes, how are you doing?" Harold settled into his chair, prepared for the kind of conversation he'd had with many former colleagues, part commiseration, part networking, part mutual support in navigating post-mill life. "Actually, that's why I'm calling," Craig said. "I followed up on that lead you gave Tyler about the hospital maintenance position, had an interview last week, got the job." "That's great news," Harold said, genuinely pleased. "Congratulations. Wanted to thank you for the tip and, well, for talking to Tyler's class. He came home that day different somehow, said you helped him understand what I was going through. Made it easier for us to talk about things." Harold was momentarily speechless. The idea that his classroom visit had affected not just the students but their families, had opened lines of communication between fathers and children, had never occurred to him. "I'm glad," he said finally. "That means a lot, Craig." After hanging up, Harold sat for a long time, contemplating the unexpected ripple effects of actions taken without clear purpose. By sharing his experience, his vulnerability, his struggle to redefine himself after the mill's closure, he had somehow helped others navigate their own transitions. It wasn't what he had set out to do. It wasn't like the tangible, measurable production of paper, but it mattered nonetheless. That evening, as he and Nancy prepared dinner together, another adjustment to their new life, sharing household tasks that had once been divided along traditional lines, Harold mentioned the call from Craig Johnson. "He got a job at the hospital," Harold explained, chopping vegetables while Nancy seasoned the chicken. "Said it was because of the lead I gave his son after that high school presentation." "That's wonderful," Nancy said, glancing up from her work. "You made a difference for their family." Harold nodded, still processing the idea. "It's strange. All those years at the mill, I measured my contribution in tons of paper produced, quotas met, deadlines achieved. Now I'm finding value in these intangible connections, conversations, shared stories, helping people in ways I never planned or anticipated." Nancy smiled. Maybe that's what Jennifer meant about reimagining Springfield's future. Not just in economic terms, but in how we connect with each other, how we find meaning and purpose beyond traditional definitions of productivity. Maybe, Harold agreed, though the concept still felt somewhat abstract to him. His instinct was still to measure value in tangible outputs, in physical products, in visible results. "You know," Nancy said, changing the subject slightly, "Heather called today while you were out. She asked again if we might consider moving to Cincinnati. There's another house for sale in their neighborhood, just a few streets over from them." Harold paused in his chopping. "What did you tell her?" "That we're still thinking about our options, that we haven't ruled anything out." Nancy looked at him directly. "Which is true, isn't it?" Harold resumed his work, considering. 6 months ago, the idea of leaving Springfield had been unthinkable. The city was home, had always been home. The connections, the memories, the sense of belonging, all were rooted in this place where generations of tanners had lived and worked. But now, with the mill closed, with former colleagues moving away or struggling to find new purpose, with downtown increasingly marked by empty storefronts and declining services, Springfield itself was changing. The city he had known, the community that had been built around manufacturing, was disappearing regardless of whether he stayed or left. And then there was Alina. The thought of watching his granddaughter grow, of being a regular presence in her life rather than an occasional visitor, pulled at him with surprising strength. "I'm more open to it than I was," he admitted, "but I'm not ready to decide yet. There's still the oral history project, and I've committed to that through the spring at least." "Of course," Nancy said, "no rush. But it's good to know you're considering possibilities. That's all Heather wants, for us to think about what might be best for our future, not just cling to what was familiar in the past." They finished preparing dinner in companionable silence, the rhythm of their shared work comfortable and soothing. As they sat down to eat, Harold found himself contemplating the parallels between their personal choices and the larger questions facing Springfield: how to honor the past without being imprisoned by it, how to imagine new possibilities while respecting what had come before, how to find meaning and purpose in a changing landscape. No easy answers presented themselves. But the questions themselves felt important, worthy of serious consideration rather than reflexive resistance or blind acceptance. "One day at a time," he said aloud, almost to himself. Nancy reached across the table to touch his hand. "Together," she added, "one day at a time together." March arrived with the first hints of spring, longer days, occasional warm breezes, the earliest crocuses pushing through the snow in their front yard. Harold continued his work with the Springfield Industrial Heritage Project, now fully engaged in helping to document the city's manufacturing past. The project had expanded beyond its initial focus on oral histories. Jennifer and her colleagues were creating an interactive website, planning a museum exhibition, developing educational materials for local schools. Harold found himself consulting on technical details, reviewing descriptions of papermaking processes, identifying machinery in old photographs, explaining industry terminology that might be unfamiliar to general audiences. "We couldn't do this without you," Jennifer told him after a particularly productive session identifying artifacts donated by former mill workers. "Your knowledge is invaluable. You notice details none of us would recognize as significant." Harold shrugged off the compliment, though it pleased him. "Just doing what I know." "That's exactly the point," she insisted. "You know things that would otherwise be lost. That's why this project matters, why your contribution matters." The validation felt good, a recognition that his decades of experience still had value, even if the specific work he had done was no longer part of Springfield's economy. It wasn't the same as the concrete satisfaction of producing tangible products, but it offered its own rewards. At home, Harold and Nancy continued their careful consideration of future possibilities. They discussed the pros and cons of staying in Springfield versus moving to Cincinnati to be near Heather and Alina. They weighed financial considerations, emotional attachments, practical realities of aging in place versus relocating, while still healthy enough to establish new routines and connections. "Whatever we decide," Nancy said one evening as they sat on the front porch, enjoying an unseasonably warm March day, "I think we're approaching it differently than we would have before the mill closed." "How do you mean?" Harold asked. "We're more deliberate, more thoughtful about what really matters to us, less driven by external expectations or assumptions about the right path," she smiled at him. "In a way, losing the certainty we once had has forced us to examine what we truly want, not just what we've always done." Harold considered this. It was true that the mill's closure had disrupted not just his employment, but his entire conception of how life should unfold, the assumptions about stability, continuity, the relationship between work and identity. That disruption, painful as it had been, had also created space for questions and possibilities he might never have considered otherwise. "I never thought I'd say this," he admitted, "but maybe there's something valuable in being forced to reimagine your life, even at our age. Not that I'd have chosen this path, but since we're on it anyway." Exactly, Nancy agreed. We're making conscious choices now, not just following the expected pattern. Their conversation was interrupted by the ringing phone. Harold went inside to answer it, returning moments later with a puzzled expression. "That was Dave Simmons," he said, rejoining Nancy on the porch. "He says there's some kind of meeting tonight at the community center, something about a new business coming to the old mill site. He thought I'd want to know. Are you going to go?" Harold hesitated. "I'm not sure. Part of me wants to know what's happening with the mill property, but another part doesn't want to hope again," Nancy finished for him. "I understand, but maybe just go and listen. You don't have to get involved." Harold nodded. "I suppose it can't hurt to hear what's being proposed." That evening, he drove to the community center, finding the parking lot surprisingly full. Inside, the meeting room was packed with familiar faces, former mill workers, local business owners, city officials. There was a buzz of conversation, an energy Harold hadn't felt in Springfield since before the mill's closure. Mayor Reynolds stood at the podium, calling for attention. "Folks, thank you for coming on such short notice. I know rumors have been circulating, so I wanted to provide accurate information directly to the community. We have some exciting news about the former Champion Mill site." Harold found a seat at the back of the room, nodding to acquaintances but avoiding detailed conversations. He wanted to hear the announcement before forming any opinion. As you know, when International Paper acquired the Champion facilities, they shuttered operations here in Springfield. The property has been vacant for several months now, with IP indicating they had no plans to resume production and were looking to sell the site. The mayor paused, building anticipation. "Today, I'm pleased to announce that a buyer has been found. Springfield Paper Collective, a new worker-owned cooperative, has purchased the smaller of the two mill buildings and 20 acres of the site." A murmur ran through the crowd. Worker-owned cooperative, this was unexpected. The collective includes former mill employees, local investors, and technical partners with experience in sustainable paper production. Their plan is to retrofit the facility for smaller-scale specialized paper manufacturing, focusing on high-quality, eco-friendly products for niche markets rather than competing with mass producers. Harold listened with cautious interest. It sounded promising in theory, but he had seen too many economic development announcements come to nothing in Springfield over the years. "I'll let Jacob Martinez, one of the cooperative's founding members, explain more about their vision and plans." A man in his 30s approached the podium, younger than most of the former mill workers in the room, but with the calloused hands and confident bearing of someone familiar with manufacturing work. "Thanks, Mayor. As someone who worked at the Champion Mill for 12 years before the closure, I understand the skepticism many of you probably feel. We've all heard promises before that didn't materialize." Jacob looked around the room, making eye contact with several former colleagues. "But this is different. We're not an outside corporation looking to extract profit from Springfield. We're community members investing in our own future." He explained the cooperative structure: ownership shared among workers and community investors, decisions made democratically, profits distributed equitably. The business model focused on specialty papers produced using more sustainable methods than traditional mass manufacturing, targeting markets willing to pay premium prices for environmentally responsible products. "We won't employ as many people as the old mill, at least not initially," Jacob acknowledged. "Our projections suggest 30 to 40 jobs in the first year, potentially growing to 100 within 5 years if our market development goes as planned. The wages won't match what Champion paid at its peak, but they'll be living wages with benefits, and every employee will have an ownership stake and a voice in decisions." Harold listened with growing interest. It wasn't a return to the past, to the massive industrial operation that had once employed thousands, but it was something. A small-scale, locally controlled adaptation of papermaking to a changed economic landscape. "We're particularly interested in connecting with former Champion employees," Jacob continued. "Your knowledge, your skills, your understanding of paper production, these are invaluable assets. Even with our different approach, the fundamental processes remain similar. We need that expertise." After Jacob finished his presentation, he opened the floor for questions. Many were practical about timelines, hiring processes, wage scales. Others were skeptical, questioning the viability of the business model, the reality of the financing, the markets for specialty papers. Jacob answered with candid honesty, acknowledging both the challenges and the opportunities. This wasn't a guaranteed success, he admitted. It was an experiment, an attempt to reimagine paper manufacturing for a changed economy. But it was an experiment grounded in real expertise, adequate capitalization, and a deep commitment to Springfield's future. We're holding an open house at the site next Saturday, Jacob concluded. Anyone interested in learning more, in seeing our initial setup, or in discussing potential employment is welcome to attend. Information sheets with details are available at the back of the room. As the meeting broke up, Harold remained in his seat, processing what he had heard. Around him, former colleagues debated the proposal's merits, some excited by the possibility of returning to papermaking, others skeptical of the cooperative model, still others simply grateful that some form of manufacturing might return to the site. Dave Simmons found him there. "What do you think, Harry? Sounds too good to be true, doesn't it?" Harold considered his response carefully. It's not Champion coming back, it's something different, smaller, more focused, structured differently. But it is papermaking, real production, not just service jobs. You thinking of applying? The question caught Harold off guard. He hadn't allowed himself to consider the possibility of returning to work, any work, let alone papermaking. At 60, with his severance package and pension, with the new rhythms he was establishing in his post-employment life, the idea of rejoining the workforce seemed improbable. And yet, I don't know, he said honestly. Maybe. Not full-time, but if they need experienced people for training or consulting, maybe. Dave nodded. I'm going to the open house next weekend. Check it out for myself. You should come too. Maybe I will. On the drive home, Harold found his mind racing with unexpected possibilities. He had been adapting to life after the mill, finding new purposes through the oral history project, his woodworking, his community connections. He had been considering a move to Cincinnati to be near a liner. He had been, in Nancy's words, reimagining his future. And now this, a potential return to papermaking, albeit in a very different context than before. Not a return to the past, but a kind of bridge between what had been and what